Russia will get hit with very, very hard economic sanctions, greater than the ones that are at the moment, with probably a deliberate wrecking ball approach to the international global economy, where it's focused on Russia, and Trump will do that. But he will then, I suspect, take the gloves off in his support for Ukraine. If he can get over what I think is a personal beef between him and Zelensky, that is the one thing that I think is proving real difficulties in Trump dealing with Ukraine. He seems to be petulant in his view of Zelensky. But if Putin doesn't comply, and if Putin doesn't have some form of control over Trump, because there's always that potential that's there, then Trump would take the gloves off.
And in terms of the details of this ceasefire, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, has said it depends. They want to comb through what is written in there. What kind of things would they be looking for? What kind of details can you inspect in a ceasefire agreement?
Oh, there's so much in there. We haven't even got both sides on the same sheet of paper at the moment. So again, this is a level of speculation that is based on me having been involved in a couple of ceasefire agreements in the past, implementing those, the Dayton ceasefire agreement, and then what was negotiated between the Serbs and the Kosovo Albanians and elsewhere. And it's extremely complex. It's one of the first requirements is to try and identify where all of the different troops are, and then where all of the hazards are. So it'll be mapping out in military speak where the different heavy bits of equipment are, where the artillery is, where your trench lines are. It'll be then looking at mapping out where people their minefields and the hazard areas, so those can be plotted, so that those can start to be fed into the military engineering capabilities and the civilian NGOs that would be starting to come in to clear that at some stage of the future. But it's trying to get that. The initial stages is A, to keep both sides apart, and then B, to start to map the totality of what needs to be done next to try and bring peace and a lasting peace into the region, and calculate how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to be to be able to properly achieve that.
Yeah, and in that light of keeping both sides apart, one of the challenges must be to actually persuade troops to pull back, to create a gap between the two sides along the front line. Because they're not going to want to give up. They'll see it as giving up territory that they fought hard and lost to gain.
Yeah, well, I don't think they'll give up. Yeah, I don't think they'll move away from territory unless the peace agreement has said that there has to be a geographic separation between the two sides, which could well be in there. But the troops, if they think that pulling back is going to mean that they're not going to be fighting again, believe me, troops in the front line will be quite happy to do that. And this will give them time to properly prepare further positions. Troops do not like fighting. There's a myth out in society that all military are warmongers. No, most people in the military are pacifists. The difference is they have to fight for peace, not protest for peace.
And in his rush to get a deal done, President Zelensky has proven to Trump that he's willing here. What evidence do you think would be needed to prove that Russia, even if they say yes to a ceasefire, what evidence do they need to prove that they are genuine about peace? Because it is the what next, which is the big question as well.
Yeah, well, there's the evidence that will come in the short term, and then there's the long-term evidence. I think from a long-term perspective, there isn't anything they can do. They have broken every agreement that they have ever signed in history. So people will be skeptical of that. But I don't think Donald Trump is too worried about the long term. It's all short term. And the Russians will provide, once they've made that decision to say, if they make that decision to say they're going to go for a peace agreement, they will provide whatever is needed, whether they believe it or not, whether that's on paper, whether that's the movement of troops, whether that's anything, just to be seen to comply. But whilst they're doing that, they'll be planning other things to try and get back in again, work out what they're doing in the future. We have to remember Donald Trump is working on his first 100 days at the moment. That's why he's pushing this quite hard. Vladimir Putin is working on the next 5 or 10 years. We're in completely different timeframes.
And of course, there is always the danger that should President Putin play too much for time, that Trump will just get frustrated and walk away.
Oh, very much so. And if that happens, Russia will get hit with very, very hard economic sanctions, greater than the ones that are at the moment, with probably a deliberate wrecking ball approach to the international global economy, where it's focused on Russia, and Trump will do that. But he will then, I suspect, take the gloves off in his support for Ukraine. If he can get over what I think is a personal beef between him and Zelensky, that is the one thing that I think is proving real difficulties in Trump dealing with Ukraine. He seems to be petulant in his view of Zelensky. But if Putin doesn't comply, and if Putin doesn't have some form of control over Trump, because there's always that potential that's there, then Trump would take the gloves off.
Okay, I know we're sort of in realms of the unknown at the moment, but supposing we get the ceasefire for 30 days, and after 30 days, we're nowhere near a peace deal, an extension is needed. At what point is that totally counterproductive? Because it does give an opportunity for the aggressor to build up its stocks, rebuild, resupply.
It gives both sides the chance to refurbish, reorganize, build their stocks up, resupply, and prepare to go again. And both sides will do that automatically. It's what can then be done to try and stop that from happening, potentially with the Russians, and to help the Ukrainians get in a position where they are ready to defend if they need to. It's a very difficult balancing act, and this is something that is purely in the political domain. This is something that will be decided at Donald Trump, Marcus Rubio, Vladimir Putin, and President Zelensky's level, influenced by some of the EU leaders. But they will decide when enough is enough. There's been too long, and what to do next. And both sides have to be prepared for what to do next, including getting back to conflict as quickly as possible. The difficulty is, if we go back to conflict after a time of ceasefire and all the rest of it, it means that there's likely to be more casualties. It's going to be bloodier. It's going to be harder compared to if you just let the conflict go on at the pace it's doing at the moment.
And that would presumably put into all kinds of danger this prospective minerals deal that Donald Trump so badly wants. What kind of security guarantees do you think that in itself, if it is agreed, and its suggestions are that it is pretty much so, accepting NATO membership, accepting that that is off the table, what kind of security guarantees can that in itself provide?
Well, the minerals deal is interesting because most of the minerals are what has been assessed to be in the ground. They are not economically viable mines at the moment. Some are, but that's a minority. Some of the mines are in the areas that Russia has got. But it's interesting that Donald Trump is getting Zelensky to sign the deal on it. So that's a recognition of Ukrainian sovereign territory, I believe. I think this is a very, very long-term issue in getting those minerals out. The Americans are extremely short of rare earth minerals that are independent of Chinese supply. This all comes back to China again and China's influence. So securing stocks that are in the ground is something that Donald Trump can see for longer-term U.S. security. It'll provide a level of support because if the Russians attack in again and undermine what America's spending hundreds of millions of dollars in beginning to exploit and get out of the ground, that will have an economic impact. And we see it's the economic impact that's driving Donald Trump's decision making. Now, none of this is going to happen in Trump's time. So we're talking of if J.D. Vance is the next president or J.D. Vance in his second presidency, if that comes in, we're looking and crystal ball gazing way into the future here.
And Philip, there have been creative suggestions already made, though, about securing Ukraine, ranging from immediate access into NATO, should Russia renege on a peace deal, NATO-style Article 5 protection without NATO membership, or simply arming Ukraine to the hilt so it can fight back effectively itself. What do you think might be the most likely kind of proposals that actually become reality?
Well, I think the most likely proposal to become reality will be a coalition of the willing, as we've heard Keir Starmer and Francois Macron, the French president, talk about. That coalition of the willing giving national bilateral guarantees into Ukraine for an Article 5 type level of support. If they put troops on the ground and can sustain them. This all depends on what the force package of troops on the ground will look like, what the impact that will have on the militaries that are supplying those in, and the way that can be funded and over what period of time. We have to remember simple little operations like Cyprus, which was 72, 73, 74, was in United Nations terms called a short-term operation. Well, we're still deploying a battalion plus into peacekeeping in a very small area compared to what we've got in Ukraine, all these decades later. This could turn into something that absorbs Europe's military capability for the next 25, 50 years easily.
And on the coalition of the willing, what do you think is the most productive thing that can come out of this meeting of defence ministers in Paris right now?
I think it's political cooperation and political understanding. It's understanding who can do what, where, when. So some countries can say that they can provide troops immediately. UK and France have already done that. Other countries can say, yes, we can supply troops, but we've got our own political processes to go through, and we've got difficulties with that. In particular, Germany. Germany needs its parliament to authorise the deployment of any troops. It hasn't got its parliament formed yet because the coalition government hasn't been formally formed yet. So it's got real difficulties. I'm surprised Francois Macron has said yes to French troops. It's good that he's got the power to do that outside parliamentary approval, because he has real difficulties in there. And a lot of the smaller nations are having real difficulty, and they're trying to balance off their internal political position with what they need to do from an international geopolitical perspective. And I think this meeting that's happened, and there's going to be lots of them, will continue to refine the understanding of all sides as to what the art of the possible is in that. And once you've got that art of the possible from a political perspective, you can then start to map out what the art of the reality is from a military perspective, and then match that to what the tasks could be in the ground, and come up with something that could be realistically deployed and sustained for a long period of time.
And just finally, Philip, do you have a view at this point on how close we are to the end of the Russia-Ukraine war, and what would constitute a just peace?
I think we're a long way off. A just peace from a geopolitical perspective would be Russia withdrawing completely and the international borders of Ukraine being restored back to their pre-2014 levels, without caveat at all. But I don't think we're going to get there. And I think we're a long, long way off a long-term peace in Ukraine. There may be something that is a bit like we see in the Korean Peninsula, where there is a cessation of conflict, but that has to be heavily policed, and that could go on for decades and decades and decades.
Philip Ingram, good to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news, or read it on thetimes.com.